December 31st, 2006. London. A quiet transaction takes place that barely registers in the financial press. The British Treasury wires $83 million to Washington. Final payment. After 61 years, Britain has at last settled its war debt to America. But this isn't a story about repayment. This is a story about extraction. The invoice for World War II wasn't just measured in blood and steel. It was measured in the systematic financial evisceration of the greatest empire the world had ever known. And the architect of that destruction wasn't Adolf Hitler. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. September 1st, 1939. German tanks roll into Poland. Britain declares war 2 days later. At this moment, the British Empire stands at the apex of global power. 24% of the world's land surface flies the Union Jack. From Singapore to Gibraltar, from Bombay to Cairo, British currency, British law, British culture dominates a quarter of humanity. The financial numbers tell an even more impressive story. Britain holds $22 billion in overseas investments, the equivalent of $450 billion today. The pound sterling serves as the world's reserve currency, backed by massive gold reserves and the productive capacity of an empire spanning 35 million square kilometers. London, not New York, is the beating heart of global finance. But there's a problem. A catastrophic problem that British leadership refuses to acknowledge. Everything Britain needs to fight this war, the tanks, the planes, the ammunition, the fuel, must be purchased from overseas. And the only nation capable of supplying these materials in sufficient quantity sits across the Atlantic. The United States. And America has no intention of being generous. President Roosevelt faces a delicate political situation. The American public, scarred by the horrors of the First World War, demands neutrality. Isolationist sentiment runs deep. In 1935, 1936, and 1937, Congress passes a series of neutrality acts explicitly forbidding arms sales to nations at war. America will not be dragged into another European bloodbath. But Roosevelt sees an opportunity. Britain desperately needs American weapons. And America, slowly emerging from the Great Depression, needs markets. The Neutrality Acts contain a loophole, a provision that will prove fatal to British financial independence. Cash and carry. In November 1939, just 2 months after war begins, Congress amends the Neutrality Act. Belligerent nations can now purchase American arms, but only if they pay in gold or U.S. dollars up front, and only if they transport the materials on their own ships. No credit, no loans, no deferred payment, cash on the barrel, and carry it yourself. For Britain, this isn't just inconvenient. It's a death sentence written in financial language. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government has no choice. German forces are preparing to sweep across Europe. Britain's own industrial capacity, though substantial, cannot match the Wehrmacht's momentum. American factories offer the only solution. Britain begins the process that will systematically drain its wealth into American coffers. The gold starts flowing immediately. In early 1940, as the phony war gives way to blitzkrieg, British cargo ships begin making regular voyages across the North Atlantic. There holds carry gold bullion from the Bank of England's reserves. Tons of it. The precious metal that once backed the pound sterling as the world's dominant currency now sits in American vaults, traded for steel, aluminum, rifles, and aircraft. But it's not enough. Britain's gold reserves, though substantial, cannot sustain this hemorrhaging indefinitely. British economists calculate the grim mathematics. At current rates of expenditure, the empire will be financially exhausted within months. Churchill, who replaces Chamberlain as Prime Minister in May 1940, confronts a reality more terrifying than German bombers over London. Britain faces bankruptcy long before it faces invasion. The solution comes in the form of Operation Fish, one of the largest movements of wealth in history and one of the least known. In the summer of 1940, as France collapses and Britain prepares for potential invasion, Churchill's government makes a desperate decision. Nearly £2 billion in British gold reserves and negotiable securities will be secretly evacuated to Canada. From there, these assets will serve as collateral for purchases from the United States. The logistics stagger the imagination. Cruisers and destroyers, their holds packed with gold bars, navigate U-boat-infested waters. Securities representing ownership in British companies worldwide, bonds, stock certificates, the paper embodiment of empire, are crated and shipped across the Atlantic. Britain's financial sovereignty, literally boxed up and sent to North America. But even this proves insufficient. By December 1940, as London burns under German incendiary bombs, British finances approach the breaking point. Churchill writes to Roosevelt with stark honesty. The moment is approaching when Britain will no longer be able to pay cash for supplies. When that moment arrives, British resistance will collapse not from military defeat, but from financial exhaustion. The pound of flesh has been extracted. The gold has been transferred. Britain's overseas investments are being liquidated at fire sale prices to American buyers. Companies built over generations of imperial commerce sold off to keep the weapons flowing. And now Britain stands on the precipice of total insolvency. The greatest empire in history, reduced to beggary. Roosevelt understands this perfectly. He also understands that a British collapse would leave Germany dominant in Europe and America facing a hostile Atlantic. But more importantly, he recognizes an unprecedented opportunity. Britain's desperation can be transformed into American advantage. The old imperial order can be dismantled. The pound sterling can be dethroned. And the dollar, the American dollar, can rise to unchallenged supremacy. The mechanism for this transfer of power already has a name. It will be called Lend-Lease, and it will be sold to the American public as an act of generosity. But the terms buried in the fine print tell a different story. This isn't a loan. This isn't charity. This is conquest by contract. March 11, 1941. Roosevelt signs the Lend-Lease Act into law. The legislation passes Congress with Roosevelt's famous garden hose analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of lending them your hose. You help, expecting the hose to be returned when the fire is out. The analogy is brilliant rhetoric. It's also a masterpiece of misdirection. Britain will receive $31.4 billion in Lend-Lease aid over the course of the war, $433 billion in modern terms. Ships, aircraft, food, raw materials, everything necessary to continue fighting. And Britain won't have to pay cash up front. But Britain will most certainly pay. Just not in ways the British public understands. The first cost is immediate and visible to those paying attention. Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement contains language that British negotiators recognize as devastating. In exchange for American aid, Britain agrees to the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce and the reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers. This sounds reasonable. This sounds like standard diplomatic language about free trade. What it actually means is the dismantling of imperial preference. For over a century, Britain's economic dominance has rested on a system of preferential tariffs within its empire. Canadian wheat, Australian wool, Indian cotton, South African minerals all trade within the empire at preferential rates, disadvantaging non-empire competitors. This system, formalized at the Ottawa Conference of 1932, creates an enormous trading bloc effectively closed to American goods. Roosevelt demands its destruction. Article 7 represents the opening assault on the economic architecture of empire. And Churchill, with German armies at the gates, signs it. The second cost becomes clear when Lend-Lease supplies begin arriving. They're not free. They're not even cheap. They're available on deferred payment, but only after Britain has proven complete financial exhaustion. American officials demand regular, humiliating demonstrations that Britain has liquidated all possible assets before receiving aid. British holdings in American companies, painstakingly accumulated over decades, are seized and sold. Courtaulds American viscose plants. Shell Oil's U.S. operations. American Viscose Corporation, one of the largest rayon manufacturers in the United States, majority owned by British investors, forcibly purchased by the U.S. government for a fraction of its value, then resold to American buyers. The sales are presented as voluntary. They're nothing of the sort. American negotiators make clear that Lend-Lease aid depends on Britain first exhausting its own resources. The British government, desperate for American aircraft and tanks, has no leverage. Assets are sold at Depression-era prices. Decades of investment returns evaporated. By 1943, Britain has liquidated approximately £1 billion in overseas assets. The empire's investment portfolio, built over generations of capital accumulation, is being strip-mined to fund immediate war needs. The future is being sold to survive the present. But the Americans want more than money. They want structural changes that will prevent Britain from ever regaining its pre-war economic dominance. July 1944. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Delegates from 44 allied nations gather for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. The stated goal, establishing a stable post-war economic order. The actual agenda, determining who will control global finance when the guns finally fall silent. The British delegation is led by John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most brilliant economist of the 20th century. At 61 years old, in failing health, Keynes understands that this conference will determine Britain's economic future. He arrives with a proposal designed to preserve some measure of British financial independence. The Keynes plan proposes an international clearing union with its own currency, the Bancor, for settling international accounts. The system would prevent any single nation from dominating global finance and would allow Britain to maintain sterling's role as a reserve currency alongside the dollar. It's elegant, sophisticated, and designed to create a multipolar financial world. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, has different ideas. White's plan is simpler and more brutal. The dollar will serve as the world's reserve currency. The dollar will be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. All other currencies will be fixed to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both headquartered in Washington and dominated by American voting power, will enforce this system. The negotiations are not between equals. Britain is bankrupt. Its gold reserves have been exhausted. Its overseas assets have been liquidated. Its cities have been bombed. Its people have endured 5 years of total war and crushing austerity. British negotiators have no cards to play. Keynes fights brilliantly, marshalling every argument, every economic principle, every appeal to shared sacrifice and alliance. He loses on virtually every point. The Bretton Woods Agreement, signed on July 22, 1944, enshrines dollar supremacy. Sterling's centuries-long reign as the world's reserve currency is over. The Bank of England will no longer set global monetary policy. That power now belongs to the Federal Reserve. The British Empire's financial architecture has been demolished and replaced with American institutions operating under American rules. Keynes returns to London exhausted and defeated. He understands what has happened. Britain won the war. America won the future. But the destruction isn't complete. There's one final mechanism that will transform British weakness into American dominance, one last contract that will seal the Empire's fate. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. German forces surrender. In London, massive crowds celebrate in the streets. Churchill addresses cheering throngs from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Britain has survived its darkest hour. The nation has stared into the abyss of Nazi conquest and emerged victorious. The celebration lasts exactly 1 day. On May 9th, reality arrives in the form of an American cable. Lend-Lease is terminated immediately. Supplies already in transit are recalled or must be paid for in cash. Britain, which has structured its entire wartime economy around American aid, faces immediate catastrophe. The termination isn't unexpected. The Lend-Lease Act explicitly limited aid to the duration of hostilities. But the abruptness shocks British officials. No transition period. No gradual reduction. The spigot simply shuts off. Britain still has a war to fight. Japan remains undefeated. British forces are engaged across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But more critically, Britain faces the staggering cost of reconstruction. Cities need rebuilding. Infrastructure needs repair. Industry needs retooling for peacetime production. The British people, after 6 years of sacrifice, expect improvements in their lives. All of it requires imports. Food, raw materials, machinery, fuel. Britain's war-devastated economy cannot produce these in sufficient quantities. The sterling area's dollar reserves have been exhausted. And the United States, now producing more than half of the world's manufactured goods, is the only possible source for what Britain desperately needs. Churchill, defeated in a stunning election upset by Clement Attlee's Labour Party, is no longer Prime Minister. The new government faces a choice that isn't really a choice at all. Accept American terms for a post-war loan, or watch the British economy collapse into a depression that would make the 1930s look prosperous. The negotiations for what becomes the Anglo-American loan begin in September 1945. Keynes, despite his failing heart, leads the British team one final time. He hopes for a grant or at least generous terms recognizing Britain's sacrifice and contribution to Allied victory. He asks for $6 billion. The American team, led by William Clayton and Fred Vinson, has other ideas. The discussions last 3 months. They are, by all accounts, brutal. American negotiators treat Britain not as a victorious ally, but as a distressed debtor requiring structural adjustment. The terms that emerge would be considered harsh by loan sharks. December 6, 1945. The Anglo-American. Financial agreement is signed in Washington. Britain receives a loan of $3.75 billion plus another $586 million to settle outstanding Lend-Lease accounts. The total, $4.34 billion. This is less than three-quarters of what Keynes requested, and it comes with conditions designed to permanently cripple British economic power. First, the interest rate. Britain will pay 2% annually. This sounds reasonable until you understand the context. This is not a commercial loan between private entities. This is a loan from one victorious ally to another after the most destructive war in human history. The United States is charging interest to the nation that stood alone against Nazi Germany while America remained neutral, that absorbed German bombing campaigns, that sacrificed more than 400,000 of its citizens. American negotiators reject arguments that the loan should be interest-free. They reject suggestions that it should be a grant. They structure it purely as a commercial transaction. Britain will pay every penny back with interest. Victory doesn't earn gratitude. It earns a bill. Second, and far more devastating, is the convertibility clause. Beginning 1 year after the loan takes effect, Britain must make the pound sterling freely convertible with the dollar. Anyone holding pounds can exchange them for dollars at a fixed rate. British economists understand immediately that this is catastrophic. Britain's economy is shattered. Its productive capacity is a fraction of America's. The moment convertibility takes effect, anyone with sterling will exchange it for dollars to buy American goods. The pound will hemorrhage value. Sterling reserves will evaporate. The British economy will collapse. Keynes fights against this provision with everything he has left. He explains in excruciating detail why Britain cannot survive convertibility in its current weakened state. The American negotiators don't care. The convertibility clause remains. Third, the loan requires Britain to support the Bretton Woods Agreement and end imperial preference, finishing the work started in the Lend-Lease Agreement. The empire's economic structure must be dismantled. British markets must be open to American goods. The protected trading system that helped build British prosperity will be destroyed. Keynes returns to London a broken man. He has fought brilliantly and lost completely. The Anglo-American loan agreement must be approved by Parliament, and Keynes must defend terms he knows are designed to destroy British economic independence. The parliamentary debates in December 1945 are bitter. Conservative MPs attack the loan as national humiliation. Labour members complain about American demands. But everyone understands the alternative. Without the loan, Britain faces immediate economic collapse. The vote passes, though barely. In the House of Commons, 343 to 100. In the House of Lords, 90 to 8. Britain has voted to accept its own financial subjugation. Keynes dies 4 months later, in April 1946, at age 62. His heart, weakened by years of stress and overwork, finally fails. Some believe it was broken long before it stopped beating. But the true catastrophe is still ahead. July 15, 1947. The convertibility clause takes effect. Exactly as British economists predicted, disaster follows immediately. Anyone holding sterling rushes to convert it to dollars. The drain is spectacular. In the first 2 weeks, Britain loses $400 million from its reserves. By mid-August, the hemorrhaging reaches $183 million per week. At this rate, Britain will be completely bankrupt in a month. The panic isn't just about currency exchange. It's about economic reality. Britain in 1947 is still operating under wartime rationing. Bread, meat, coal, clothing, basic necessities remain severely limited. The British people, exhausted after years of sacrifice, face continued austerity, while America enjoys unprecedented prosperity. Anyone with money wants to hold it in dollars, not the currency of an economically devastated nation. The sterling crisis of 1947 becomes a full-blown catastrophe. The Bank of England's reserves plummet towards zero. British imports collapse as trading partners refuse to accept pounds that tomorrow will be worth less than today. Industries shut down from lack of raw materials. Unemployment surges. The government faces the possibility of being unable to pay for food imports, potentially leading to genuine starvation. On August 20th, after just 5 weeks, convertibility is suspended. The experiment has failed spectacularly, leaving Britain's financial credibility in ruins and its dollar reserves depleted. The humiliation is complete. The crisis forces the British government to accept even harsher austerity measures. Import restrictions intensify. Rationing, which British citizens hoped would ease after the war, instead becomes more severe. In 1948, bread rationing, never imposed even during the darkest days of the war, is finally introduced. The British people are living under worse material conditions than during the actual fighting. Meanwhile, America's economy booms. By 1947, the United States controls 70% of the world's gold reserves, up from 46% before the war. American GDP has doubled during the war years, while Britain's has stagnated. American companies dominate global markets while British firms struggle to survive. The dollar reigns supreme while the pound limps along, a shadow of its former dominance. The cost of victory has become staggeringly clear. Britain defeated Nazi Germany, but it destroyed itself in the process. And the nation that benefited most was the one that entered the war late, after Britain had been bled nearly dry. The consequences ripple outward through the late 1940s and 50s. The British Empire, that vast global structure built over centuries, begins its rapid disintegration. Not because of military defeat, but because Britain can no longer afford it. India gains independence in 1947. The jewel in the crown gone. Burma, Ceylon, Palestine, colonies that Britain can no longer afford to administer or defend. The withdrawal isn't noble decolonization driven by moral awakening. It's forced retreat driven by bankruptcy. Britain literally cannot pay the salaries of colonial administrators or the costs of military garrisons. In 1949, the pound is devalued 30% against the dollar. Another devastating blow to British prestige and purchasing power. In 1956, the Suez Crisis demonstrates conclusively that Britain can no longer act as a great power without American approval. When President Eisenhower threatens financial pressure, the British government immediately backs down from its military operation. The empire's last gasp becomes a humiliating retreat. By 1971, when President Nixon finally abandons the gold standard, the Bretton Woods system technically ends. But dollar dominance doesn't. The infrastructure of American financial power, built on the ruins of British economic might, proves self-sustaining. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. The Federal Reserve remains the de facto central bank of the global economy. Wall Street remains the heart of international finance. And Britain? Britain finally makes its last payment on the wartime debt in December 2006. 61 years of payments. $7.5 billion total, including interest. For a loan of $4.34 billion. The compound interest of empire's end, calculated in dollars. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real cost cannot be measured in dollars or pounds. It must be measured in the architecture of global power. In September 1939, Britain stood at the apex of the international order. The pound sterling was the currency of global commerce. British banks financed international trade. British shipping lines carried the world's goods. British insurance companies underwrote global risks. The City of London was the undisputed financial capital of the world. By 1950, all of this had transferred to New York. The mechanisms of this transfer were designed with surgical precision. Cash and carry extracted Britain's gold reserves and liquidated its dollar assets before the United States even entered the war. Lend-Lease prevented British financial recovery by forcing asset sales and ending imperial preference. Bretton Woods institutionalized dollar supremacy through international organizations controlled by American voting power. The Anglo-American loan imposed convertibility that deliberately triggered financial crisis. And the response to that crisis, permanent austerity and imperial retreat, locked in Britain's subordinate position. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of global war. It was systematic, methodical, and thoroughly documented in State Department memos, Treasury Department negotiations, and congressional testimony. American policymakers understood exactly what they were doing. In July 1945, a State Department memo assessed Britain's financial position. The British will be in our hands. Another Treasury Department document from the same period noted that Britain's weakness presented an unparalleled opportunity to establish American economic predominance. The language is clinical, but the meaning is clear. Britain's desperation wasn't a problem to be solved through alliance generosity. It was an opportunity to be exploited for American advantage. Consider the counterfactual. What if the United States had treated Britain after World War II the way it would later treat Western Europe under the Marshall Plan? What if American loans had been grants or at least interest-free? What if convertibility requirements had been delayed until Britain's economy recovered? What if the Bretton Woods system had incorporated Keynes's proposal for a genuinely multinational currency? Britain would likely have recovered its economic strength within a decade. The pound might have remained a major reserve currency alongside the dollar. The British Empire's decolonization might have been more gradual and less chaotic. The post-war international order might have been genuinely multipolar rather than American-dominated. But that's not what American policymakers wanted. They wanted supremacy, and they got it. The irony cuts deep. Britain entered World War II to defend Poland's sovereignty against German aggression. Britain fought longer than any other major power, from September 1939 to August 1945, 6 full years of total war. British cities absorbed devastating bombing campaigns. British civilians endured rationing, displacement, and privation. British forces fought across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic. And the nation that profited most was the one that remained neutral while Britain bled, that charged interest on weapons while British cities burned, that used British desperation to dismantle British power. There's a word for this in the language of international relations: extraction. And it's usually associated with colonialism. The imperial power enters a weaker nation, exploits its resources, extracts its wealth, and leaves it impoverished. The British did this across their empire for centuries. The United States did it to Britain in 6 years. The parallel isn't perfect, of course. Britain wasn't conquered militarily. It wasn't occupied by foreign troops. But the financial mechanisms achieved what military conquest achieves: the transfer of wealth and power from the defeated to the victor. Only in this case, both nations were technically on the winning side. American defenders of these policies argue they were simply business transactions between sovereign nations. Britain could have refused the loans. It could have rejected Lend-Lease. It could have declined to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement. This argument ignores the reality of Britain's position. A man dying of thirst in the desert hasn't really made a free choice when he sells everything he owns for water. Britain's desperation wasn't natural disaster. It was created by Germany's aggression that Britain fought while America watched. The exploitation of that desperation was a choice American policymakers made deliberately. There's also the argument that American loans saved Britain from complete collapse. Without American aid, Britain might have been forced to negotiate peace with Germany, or might have fallen to invasion. This is possibly true, but it misses the point. The question isn't whether American aid was necessary. The question is whether the terms of that aid needed to be deliberately structured to destroy British economic power permanently. The answer is no. America could have been generous to its ally. It chose extraction instead. The lessons of this history echo forward into the 21st century. They explain why the dollar remains dominant decades after American manufacturing supremacy faded. They explain why international financial institutions remain centered in Washington and New York. They explain why American sanctions and financial controls carry global weight that no other nation can match. The infrastructure of American financial hegemony was built between 1939 and 1950, constructed on the ruins of British economic power. That infrastructure remains essentially intact. The Federal Reserve can trigger global recessions with interest rate decisions. The U.S. Treasury can cut off nations from dollar clearing systems and destroy their international trade. American credit rating agencies can collapse foreign bond markets with downgrades. This is the inheritance of World War II's hidden cost. Britain paid for victory with its empire, its reserves, its economic independence, and its global status. America collected the payment and used it to build an empire of its own, not territorial, but financial. An empire of ledgers rather than maps, of debt rather than colonies, of dollar dominance rather than gunboat diplomacy. And here's the final irony: Britain is still paying. In 2006, when Britain made that last payment of $83 million, the wartime debt was technically settled. But the transfer of financial power remains. British banks operate in the shadow of Wall Street. The pound trades as a secondary currency beneath dollar dominance. The Bank of England makes monetary policy with constant attention to Federal Reserve decisions. The war ended in 1945. The conquest is permanent. This is what victory looks like when you win the war, but lose the peace. Britain defeated fascism. America defeated Britain. And the world inherited a financial order built on that defeat, an order where one nation holds the power that empires once distributed among many. The bombers have long since fallen silent. The battlefields have become peaceful farmland. The ruins have been rebuilt, but the balance sheets remain unbalanced. The contracts remain binding, and the dollar remains supreme. December 31, 2006. London wires $83 million to Washington. Final payment on a debt incurred 60 years earlier. The BBC runs a brief story. Most Britons don't notice. The Americans barely register it. But somewhere in the Treasury departments and central banks, analysts understand what this payment represents. It's the last installment on the price of empire. The final accounting of history's most successful peaceful transfer of global hegemony. Britain went to war to defend freedom. It emerged victorious and bankrupt. America stayed neutral, charged interest, and inherited the world. And that transaction, dressed up as alliance and painted over with rhetoric about shared sacrifice, was the greatest heist in history. The cost of World War II wasn't just paid in blood and cities. It was paid in gold, in sterling, in assets, in sovereignty, and in the slow, systematic dismantling of British power. And the beneficiary wasn't the nations that fought beside Britain. It was the nation that waited, watched, and carefully calculated exactly how much to charge for salvation. The invoice came due. Britain paid, and America collected an empire. If you found this story of hidden history compelling, there's more where this came from. The narratives they didn't teach you in school, the financial engineering behind great power shifts, the economic mechanisms of empire, the real costs of the wars we celebrate, are waiting to be explored. Subscribe to see how history's greatest transformations weren't won on battlefields, but in counting houses and negotiating rooms. Because understanding who won the war means understanding who won the peace. And that story is far more disturbing than what you learned in textbooks.